It is from the outbreak of the First World War, all the horrors of the 20th century were to flow. On that letter, the fortunes of Europe will turn. The Kaiser is sort of blustering, crying and shouting. When we introduce the British,
they're all fishing.
The Austrians all live on the Strudelhof and have ridiculous names.
Wilhelm really hates.
He called him Satan. One of history's great loose cannons, I think it's fair to say. Is he a friend of the rest of his history, Tom?
I think he is.
Now they've got to the culprit.
There was a majestic, rapturous, and even seductive something in this first outbreak of the people from which one could escape only with difficulty. And in spite of all my hatred and aversion for war, I should not like to have missed the memory of those first days. As never before, thousands and hundreds of thousands felt what they should have felt in peacetime, that they belonged together. A city of 2 million, a country of nearly 50 million, in that hour felt that they were participating in world history, in a moment which would never recur, and that each one was called upon to cast his infinitesimal self into the glowing mass, there to be purified of all selfishness. All differences of class, rank and language were flooded over at that moment by the rushing feeling of fraternity. Strangers spoke to one another in the streets. People who had avoided each other for years shook hands. Everywhere one saw excited faces. So that was Stefan Zweig, the great Austrian writer, in The World of Yesterday, which he wrote in 1942 in the midst of a second terrible world war, about the outbreak of the First World War. And Dominic, we quoted him, didn't we, at the beginning of our last episode, which was the final episode about the murder in Sarajevo of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. And we're now beginning a kind of sister series to that, where we look at how that murder, that assassination, led Europe to the outbreak of war. And
yes.
I guess the thing that lots of people think they know is that the war was greeted with great enthusiasm and that it was kind of driven by emotions and feelings of jingoism, and that this is an explanation for what happened. But the truth is much more complex, isn't it?
It is more complicated. And of course, that reading could hardly be more darkly ironic. Because as we said at the end of our Sarajevo series, Stefan Zweig is one of those people who his writings have come to embody the lost world of the Habsburg Empire, of kind of Europe before the fall, I suppose. And that moment that he's talking about is arguably the greatest calamity in human history, because it is from that moment, the outbreak of the First World War, that all the horrors of the 20th century were to flow. So obviously the First World War itself, the rise of Nazism, the rise of Bolshevism, the Second World War, the Holocaust, communism, the Cold War, all of these things.
The division of Europe.
The division of Europe, exactly. And actually the division of Europe, which obviously cuts right through the world that he's talking about, that Habsburg
the Austro-Hungarian Empire gets divided on either side of the Iron Curtain.
The world that belongs together, he says, that's all going to be sundered forever. Well, not forever, but for generations.
And so I suppose the moment that war breaks out, people are asking why, aren't they?
Yeah.
So you, in your notes here, you quote Rebecca West in The Black Lamb and Grey Falcon, and she's at the town hall in Sarajevo, and she writes, leaning from the balcony, I said, I shall never be able to understand how it happened. It is not that there are too few facts available, but that there are too many.
Yeah. And
that is the challenge, really, isn't it? Because there are so, we did an episode on the causes of the First World War. Is it militarism? Is it nationalism? Is it the Kaiser wearing the wrong deck shoes at Cowes? I mean, all of these have obviously been advanced as theories.
One of them only by you, but let's continue.
I think distinguished historians have made that proposition. But one way that's become very popular with historians recently, Christopher Clark in Sleepwalkers and various other scholars, is to say, well, actually, let's park the idea that there are broad abstract nouns hovering around. Let's remind ourselves that actually it's about individuals in contingent circumstances. And this is obviously a kind of pre-internet age. So these are people who are operating far more in the dark than perhaps we I mean, obviously we know they didn't have the internet, but I think we are now so accustomed to an absolute blizzard of facts and news, and the idea that people in different capitals can communicate with each other, that perhaps we forget that back in 1914, the power players in the various countries, the various great powers and the second division powers, were kind of operating a bit in the dark.
Yeah, Tom. So I think that emphasis on individuals is really important, because there's a brilliant book actually called July Crisis by a guy called Thomas Otte. So for people who've read Christopher Clark's The Sleepwalkers, if you found it a little bit light and frivolous, Thomas Otte's is the book for you. So he says at the beginning of that book, the decision to mobilize millions of men to send them to do and die on the battlefield were not made by anonymous factors. They were made by real people. And he says, this is what we should look at. Count Berchtold, Theobald von Bethmann Hollweg, President Poincaré in France, Asquith and Grey in Britain, and so on and so forth. These people are they have the power of life and death over millions, and they make the decisions, the crucial decisions. And the thing is, they have always, or almost always, been completely caricatured in the popular imagination.
Yeah.
I mean, you could argue these are some of the most caricatured people in all history, because the classic thing that everybody says about them is that they are nationalistic, reactionary, warmongering old men who sent young men to die.
And that is, I mean, that's something that's very current still today, isn't it? That kind of view of them as...
Yeah, I literally Googled old men First World War, and the first thing that came up was a column in The Guardian by George Monbiot, and he ended his column about the First World War by saying the old men of Europe decided that they would rather kill their children than change their policies. And I think that's just wrong. It's just not right.
Yeah, sure, but you can see why people think that, because that is a story that is being told within a year of the outbreak of war. So there's Kipling's terrible lines that presumably are haunted by the fact that his son John dies in the Battle of Loos a year after the outbreak of war. If any question why we died, i.e. the young of Europe, tell them because our fathers lied. And then there's the terrible poem that Wilfred Owen writes, who dies, right at the end of the war, and he has the myth of Abraham about to sacrifice his son Isaac, and then the angel appears and says, "Don't sacrifice him." And in Owen's version, Abraham is offered a ram and told to sacrifice it. But the old man would not so, but slew his son and half the seed of Europe one by one. And then Benjamin Britten wrote Requiem for War about that. So it is part of the culture that derives from the experience of the war itself, isn't it?
It is.
And it has a power, inherent kind of mythic power. Owen's use of the Bible there. I mean, it's really resonant.
The idea of doomed youth, the anthem for doomed youth, youth, and the people who have doomed the youngsters are their elders. Yeah, it's got an enormous power, but it's not right. These aren't actually very old men. So most of the people who make the big decisions are actually in the prime of their lives. They're not reactionary. Many of them are actually political moderates, or in Britain, they're liberals.
Well, in Germany as well, right?
Yeah,
because the Social Democrats in Germany had just won about a third of the vote. I think,
and they agreed to go along with the war.
Yeah.
Are they driven? Sometimes sort of left-wing historians would say they were fueled by a terrible fear of revolution. But actually, when you get down into the weeds, as it were, of the crucial decisions, revolution, the idea of revolution, being frightened of socialism and stuff, that doesn't feature at all. Are they nationalists? It's always said these are wars driven by nationalism. But actually, a lot of the people we'll talk about in this series are not nationalists. They are internationalists. They are cosmopolitan people. We will see how everybody has the wrong surname because,
yes,
the Austrian guy has a Russian-sounding surname. The Russian ambassador sounds German because these are, as it were, often citizens of the world, very fluent in other languages, friends in other countries, all of that kind of thing.
I was the Kaiser and the Tsar communicate in English. Yeah, and of course they're basically all all the various emperors and kings are all descended from Queen Victoria. So,
of course,
it's literally a family affair.
When the Russian foreign minister and the German ambassador are talking to each other, they will often talk in French.
Yeah,
and the other thing is when these people are having these crucial conversations, as we will see in this series, at the end of the July crisis, so let's say the month or so after the assassination of Franz Ferdinand and Sophie, at the end of that period, many of the people we will be talking about have nervous breakdowns, or they literally start crying in front of each other because their worlds have fallen. They are so sort of ravaged by anxiety and agony and guilt and regret about what has happened. These are not warmongers, I wouldn't say, by any stretch of the imagination.
In which case, it only makes the mystery all the greater, isn't it? How these people ended up leading their countries into a war that nobody wanted.
Yeah. Well, some people did want the war. I think we should say that right away. Wars don't happen by accident. Somebody has to will it. Somebody has to make those crucial decisions. One of the points I'd make right at the beginning is we only really do this with the First World War. Up to this point, if you talked about the Crimean War, the Napoleonic Wars, the Franco-Prussian War, the 7 Years' War, whatever, we wouldn't find it inexplicable that these wars happened. I mean, people at the time thought it was perfectly reasonable that wars happened. They might say it's sad that people die, but they knew that war was a completely rational, explicable. They regarded it as an explicable tool of foreign policy.
They did. But I mean, correct me if I'm wrong here, but they thought that local wars were an acceptable tool of policy.
Yeah.
What everyone was terrified of was a general European war. I mean, maybe there aren't. I mean, I accept your point that there are certain actors in this who actually are quite keen on a general European conflagration. But most people, I get the impression, have a sense that this will be something terrible. They don't think it's going to be over by Christmas. They know that they are on the edge of a precipice.
Well, I think it's fair to say, Tom, nobody gets the war they want. There are people in the story who want a war. I expressed myself badly. There are people in this story who want a war. Nobody wants the war they get. And how they do get it, I mean, that is the mystery, isn't it? I will say one other thing, actually. I think it really matters that the trigger is as it is. When we said we were doing a Sarajevo series, and we put up pictures when we went to Sarajevo on social media, and we said, a fateful place, changed the course of world history. Some of the replies, people said, not fateful at all. The war was inevitable. It was always coming. I think that's wrong. I think the fact that the victim was who he was, actually two victims, we always forget one of the victims, Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie, that the killer was Gavrilo Princip, and that it happened in Sarajevo, I think they are massively important in explaining why things happen as they do.
People who want to hear more about the murder, we've just done a 4-part series. So let's assume that they are dead.
Yeah.
The reverberations are spreading out from Sarajevo towards Austria and across Europe. So how do we go from an assassination happening, and it's a terrible thing, but assassinations, as we said in the previous series, this is lots of people are getting killed. We listed all the kind of various members of royalty and the presidents and so on who were assassinated in the 20th century. So what is it about this assassination that is different?
Right, well, let's start from the very beginning. So the news reaches Vienna, as we described at the end of the last series. News reaches Vienna within hours. So we talked about Schlieffen Plan. In our Sarajevo series, we had a scene there of him being in a park and the band stopping playing. That is literally what happens. And it is a bit of a myth that the Austrians didn't care. It's often said, they didn't. Franz Ferdinand wasn't very popular. Who cared? That's not right. When you look at the press coverage, the newspapers, editorials talk about the monstrous of it all, our heir to the throne, the person on whom we'd placed all our hopes. Some newspapers in the Habsburg monarchy have big pictures of the orphaned children, and they will play a part in the popular sort of discourse in Austria Hungary in the next few days. So it is a shocking event in and of itself. It is not nothing. I think it's sometimes dismissed, the assassination. There are loads of assassinations. And of course there are. But even in that context, it's still a shocking thing. And right away, the Viennese papers say, well, this isn't actually like an anarchist assassination. This is the fault of another country and of Serbia. They point the finger at Serbia. And of course, Tom, as we described last time, they're not wrong. The killers almost certainly were groomed by terrorist groups that were embedded in Serbian politics and the Serbian army. They were helped across the border by Serbian intelligence. And as we described in the last series, the Serbian Prime Minister almost certainly knew that something was up before the crime happened. What is worse, from the Austrian point of view, is that the people in Serbia are openly delighted by the killings. So they are really shocked by this, the Austrians. The ambassador and his consuls and whatnot, they write back to Vienna and they say people are celebrating, people are having toasts in the coffee houses, they're laughing and singing Serbian patriotic songs and whatnot. And the Serbian prime minister gives a really inflammatory speech the day after the assassinations where, rather than sort of saying, oh gosh, what a terrible thing to have happened, we want to distance ourselves from this, the Serbian Prime Minister, Nikola Pasic, says, if the Austrians try to exploit this, we will defend ourselves and we will fulfill our duty to our country. And that obviously sends quite the wrong message as far as the Austrians are concerned.
So, I mean, this may seem a tasteless parallel, but I mention it just perhaps to convey a sense of how both the Serbians and the Austrians feel. I mean, is there perhaps a parallel with how Israel reacts to the Hamas attacks on the 7th of October last year and how people in Gaza react to the news of the attacks? And would that explain something of the passions on both sides that leads the two sides to basically feel that neither side can stand down from what's happened?
I think I totally understand the parallel you're making, Tom. I think there's also a parallel with, remember September the 11th? Remember after September the 11th, 2001, there were scenes that went around the world of people celebrating, people in, parts of the Arab world, for example, celebrating the fall of the Twin Towers in New York City. And Americans were very understandably outraged by that.
I suppose the difference being that there it was less clear which state lay behind it, whereas it was very clear that Hamas, had organised the attack, and therefore there was for Israelis a ready national entity that they could blame and declare war on. And perhaps that's the parallel. Anyway, I don't want to get too deep into it, but it's just, you're saying why did the Austrians react the way they do? Perhaps that offers some contemporary parallel that would help people to understand what's going on.
Well, remember as well, the Austrians have already been extremely anxious about Serbia. So we talked in the previous series about Austria Hungary. Austria Hungary has been in decline all through the reign of its current emperor, the 84-year-old Franz Joseph. It is this very strange empire, dual monarchy, half of it Austria, half of it Hungary, but both sides governing a load of kind of Slavs, Romanians, Italians, and whatever, Ukrainians. It kind of works, it's people, you can live your whole life under that system and be very happy and say, this is a great system, I love it. But people have a tremendous sense of anxiety about decline and about kind of fragmentation, and they look across their border at Serbia, which has doubled in size in the last 2 years. So the Serbs make no secret of their antipathy to Austria-Hungary, their belief that South Slavs living in the empire's borders should actually be part of Serbia. And there have been people, as we talked about in the previous series, within Austria-Hungary, most famously the head of their general staff, their chief general, who is a guy called Franz Conrad von Hötzendorf, who have been saying, let's have a crack at the Serbs. Let's launch a preemptive strike. We have to settle this because they will eat away at our empire. So remember we said he'd pressed for war 25 times in the course of the previous 12 months.
And the Archduke Franz Ferdinand had persisted, which is
exactly.
part of the irony, because he then gets cast as a kind of bellicose warmonger, but the opposite was the case. He was very much the spokesman for the peace party.
So the person, with Franz Ferdinand gone, the person who's going to be the key decision maker is actually an old childhood friend of his. Now, all the Austrian people in this story, Tom, have absolutely splendid names. Would you like to have a go at the Austrian foreign minister's name, or would you like me to do it?
Shall I have a crack?
Go for it.
I'll give it a go. Leopold Anton Johann Sigismund Joseph Corsinus Ferdinand Graf Berthold von und zu Ingarschitz. Is that right?
Ungarschitz.
Ungarschitz. Freitling und Pörlitz.
Yeah, Count Berchtold for short. So Count Berchtold he's actually in many ways a very attractive man. He's a Hungarian magnate, so he has loads of lands in Hungary. He loves literature, he loves art and horses. Thomas Otti in his book.
Everyone in Austria-Hungary?
I mean,
this is very much the
by
impression
law.
I get.
Well, some people probably are more into the strudels and stuff. I don't know. A charming cavalier says Tomasotti, he was seen as a man of conciliation and moderation. And he had grown up with Franz Ferdinand. His wife, Berchtolt's wife, had been one of Sophie's best friends ever since they were girls.
So it's personal for him.
So it's personal. He hears the news, and he's at his castle, which is now in the Czech Republic, a place called Buchlau, and he rushes by train to Vienna, and he goes straight into a meeting with General Conrad. So, again, it's a bit like, for our American listeners, for example, it's like the atmosphere after 9/11. They are right in a crisis meeting. What are we going to do? And Conrad says, he's still kind of Dick Cheney figure. And he says, okay, I've been telling you for years, we have to do this. If you have a poisonous adder at your heel, you stamp on its head, you do not wait for the lethal bite. And Berthold wrote in his diary, he said, Conrad, who's quite a gloomy figure because he's got this tangled love life, hasn't he, with Gina.
Yes, he just writes love letters to her that he never sends.
He's got a big scrapbook. So Conrad, with a faraway look of melancholy on his fine-featured face, he concluded emphatically with 3 words, war, war, war. So there we have one kind of leadership group who clearly do want a war. They don't want a world war, but they want a war against Serbia for what they see as completely understandable and justifiable reasons. All across the Austrian diplomatic service, and especially in Belgrade, people are saying, come on now, enough. Now we really have to launch a strike. We can't just let ourselves be humiliated on the world stage at the assassination of our heir and his wife. You've got to punish that.
And because issues of prestige, national prestige, will be a running theme throughout the story, won't it? And people are anxious that if that prestige is damaged, it will be bad for them. And so therefore, planning a war of aggression in a way is a defensive measure.
The Austrians see this as completely defensive. They say we are being provoked and provoked and provoked, and if we do not act now, when would we ever act? And do you know what, Tom? I don't think you have to be particularly Austrophile to see why that would seem illogical. The assassination of put it this way. Imagine that the Vice President of the United States was assassinated, by Cubans. Imagine that we did a podcast series about JFK. Imagine the Cubans had assassinated JFK. It had been proved. Would Washington have just said, oh, well, we'll let it go? We'll file a complaint at the International Criminal Court. Of course they wouldn't.
Well, it's so interesting, isn't it? Because Kennedy was obsessed by this. So Barbara Tuchman's book on the guns of August, he was obsessed by it, and he felt that he was trying to learn the lessons for that during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And then I think LBJ, likewise, he was determined not to generate a kind of First World War scenario after Kennedy's death. So he was very anxious about that because he had the lesson in front of him.
Well, they don't have that lesson, right? Yeah. They've never. This has not happened before.
So they don't know what's going to happen.
So there's lots of talk in the Austrian. So we're talking about 28th, 29th of June. There's lots of talk in the Austrian Foreign Ministry and elsewhere, settle accounts, as they put it, with Serbia. But of course, what does that mean? Does it mean that you crush it, or does it mean you annex it? What do you do? And also, what does it mean for the rest of Europe? So in the world of alliances, what are the consequences? And right from the start, the amazing thing, the really extraordinary thing about the Austrian response is they don't really think about that second question at all. There is all the historians who've written about it talk about their tunnel vision. They are just thinking about Serbia and they think, well, the rest of the world can take care of itself. We're not going to worry about that now. And I think part of that is they clearly feel very embattled and encircled. And they just think we can only concentrate on one thing at a time. And we're just going to think about Serbia and the rest will take care of itself. And then the second thing is I think they have a tremendous sense of the sort of a ticking clock. Time is running out, and if we don't act on this right now, we can't have those conversations. So we haven't got time. We just have to.
Because the longer they leave it, the more the shock of the assassination will fade on the international stage.
Yeah,
and the less sympathy there will be for any armed measures.
Yes. Yeah. I also think they don't really think about the possibility of a world war because they are convinced that the Serbs will back down. They had issued 2 ultimatums to Serbia before in very recent years, one in 1908 over the annexation of Bosnia and one in 1913 over the Serbs after the Balkan Wars had occupied Albania and the Austrians told them to get out. And both times the Serbians had backed down. And Count Berchtold, this very urbane cosmopolitan, not a warmonger at all, but he says to his colleagues, listen, we know that these people are just like, they're like anarchic, horrible children. And if you're firm with them, they will back down and go away. And that's what we have to do.
Well, unless they can appeal to another parent figure.
Yeah.
Which presumably lurks to the east in the form of Russia.
Exactly. So Serbia does have this patron, Russia, for their close allies. However, again, the Austrian Foreign Service say, do you know what? I don't think the Russians are going to make much of a... They'll make a fuss, but Russia is not ready for war. They're in the middle of a big rearmament program. They won't want to go to war until they finish that. Plus, they've had standoffs with the Russians before. So people often say, why is it this crisis rather than previous crises that causes the First World War? Because the Russians, for example, had backed down in 1908 when Austria had annexed Bosnia-Herzegovina. Well, the thing is, the Austrians say the Russians back down too. The Serbs back down, the Russians back down. When you are strong, they will always... And, of course, they are drawing from this the wrong lesson. They're thinking that if you back down twice, you'll back down a third time. Of course, there's always the possibility that if you've already backed down twice, you will say to yourself, never again.
Because then your prestige will be damaged.
Exactly.
That might threaten your security.
Exactly.
So the dominoes fall.
Exactly. So by 2 days after the assassination, the Austrians have pretty much made up their minds. Count Berchtold goes to see the 84-year-old monarch, Franz Joseph, at the Schönbrunn Palace, and he says, come on, we've made up our minds. Let's do this. And the monarch says, sure, okay, I agree with you. Unfortunately, we will need to get the Prime Minister of Hungary on board. We can't just go straight into this because, of course, the dual monarchy system. And the Prime Minister of Hungary is a guy called István Tisza. He's another kind of count landowner. He's from the Magyar gentry. He's a very impressive man, Tom. He was educated at Heidelberg and he's got a PhD from Oxford. He's very rich. He's very ruthless. He's very clever. He's a fanatical defender of Hungarian interests, Magyar interests. He's devoted to the monarchy, but he's always looking to get a better deal for the Hungarians. So Count Tisza says, I don't like the idea of attacking Serbia. I don't want a whole load of new Slavs in the empire. He actually says that very afternoon, so the afternoon that Berchtold has gone to see Franz Joseph at Schönbrunn, they meet, and Count Tisza says, it would be a fatal mistake to make the abominable deed of Sarajevo a pretext for settling scores with Serbia. So you might think that with that, the chances of war are gone. The Austrians have talked about it for 2 days, and bang, you're not going to have it. But Berchtold and the other people think, no, we can persuade this Hungarian guy because we will invoke our great friend, our great ally, the most richest and most powerful country in Europe, and they will sway him and they will persuade him to join us. And that country, Tom, is, of course, Germany.
Germany, at last. Okay, so I think we should take a break now. And when we come back, Dominic, let's look at how the Austrians approach Germany in the context of their plans for attacking Serbia. But before we do that, let's look at, what is it that makes Germany a great power? And are there possibly any entertaining figures at the head of the German Empire?
Are there
any entertaining figures who might rank as friends of the show? So, spoiler, there are. So don't go away. Hello and welcome back to The Rest is History. And Dominic, we are moving from Vienna to Berlin, to the heart of the German Empire. And I guess that for most people, the cause of the First World War will be, certainly if you're British, will be tied up with an image of Germany as a militarist land, a land of shaven-headed Junkers wearing, helmets with terrifying spikes on, a general sense of militarism. But that would be unfair to Wilhelmine Germany, wouldn't it?
I think it probably would be a bit unfair. First of all, there is some truth in it, but it would be a bit unfair. People who've been listening to The Rest is History for the last 3 decades will know that we once did an episode about Wilhelmite Germany with Katja Hoyer, great friend of the show. And she was painting a picture of it. And it's a really interesting and complicated place. So Germany has only existed since 1870. It was created in the Franco-Prussian War and created, of course, in France at the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles. Yeah. If you ever look at Google it, look at the painting. An amazing scene, you know, all of the very medieval, all the German princes that are there, generals, Bismarck.
Well, because it's echoing the First Reich, which was the Empire of Charlemagne, and now you have the Second Reich.
Yeah, exactly. And they have a lot to be proud of. So they are a very militaristic country. The army has lots of privileges. The army is embedded in the politics of that world. But at the same time,
Dominic, just to re-emphasize this, it is the army that has given Germany its rank as the most dominant military power in not just in Central Europe, but in Europe.
Yes,
displacing the power that previously had held that status, which was France.
Yes, exactly.
And France had not only been kind of richly humiliated by that kind of ritual in Versailles, but it had also been shorn of Alsace and Lorraine.
Yes, it had.
Frank.
Yes, it absolutely had. And what's more, I think, Germany is still a conglomeration of countries, I suppose you could say, which all happen to speak German. Some are Protestant, some are Catholic. They have very different kind of traditions. But the army, like as so often, the army is a kind of, it's an imperial institution. The army embodies Germanness in a way that other things maybe don't really do to the same extent. So the army really matters, but there is more to Germany than its army. It has the world's biggest socialist party.
Yeah, we talked about them at the start of the show. The fact that they've won, they've
Social Democrats.
a third of the seats.
They have. It has the strongest trade union movement in Europe. It has by far the most developed welfare state of any major European country. So in other words, the Kaiser's Germany, it's definitely not the Third Reich. It's not a dictatorship.
It's not Sparta.
It
has Spartan elements, but it's also, it's an intellectual powerhouse, and therefore it's a scientific powerhouse, and therefore it's an industrial powerhouse. So as a result of that, Germany has rivaled France and maybe surpassed it militarily, and it is starting to rival and perhaps surpass Britain industrially.
Yeah, in a way that actually terrifies people, as we will see. But of course, at the top of this system, it's a very colourful person. One of history's great loose cannons, I think it's fair to say. Yeah, is he a friend of the rest of history, Tom?
I think he is. I think he has accompanied us throughout many, many years of this podcast. Yeah. He always pops up, and it's great to have him back.
Yeah, Kaiser Wilhelm II. And he is the person, I guess, that most of the people listening to this podcast will say, now they've got to the culprit. Because it's the Kaiser who caused the First World War, his insane lust for conquest, his ambition to dominate Europe, he glories in suffering. What a terrible man. At the end of the First World War, people in Britain would say, hang the Kaiser. The Kaiser is solely responsible for the war, and as we'll discover,
there are scholars, aren't there, who do still make that case.
There are.
Just to say, this is still very much a live issue in history departments.
Not all scholars would make that by any case, Tom. But let's let people make up their own minds. I think what is certainly true is he is an enormously colourful and strange figure, isn't he? So he was born in 1859, and he's the oldest of Queen Victoria's 42 grandchildren. So,
because his mother is British.
Yes, because his mother is Vicky, who was Queen Victoria's sort of favourite, her favourite child in many ways, her daughter, who was sent off to marry Prince Friedrich Wilhelm of Prussia. So in 1859, she is delivered of this boy, Wilhelm, and everything goes wrong straight away. So the birth was awful, incredibly traumatic. He was a breech baby. He was almost asphyxiated, and the doctors kind of completely panicked. God knows what they were doing, but they basically tore all the nerves in his neck, kind of getting him out. And as a result, his left arm was left completely useless. So, famously, when you see pictures of him, he's always hiding his left arm, or it's sort of tucked into his jacket, or it's in his pocket or something.
And I guess if you're a psychologist, and Germany and Austria are the great homes of psychology as well, you would say that perhaps there's some compensation going on in the fact that he will grow up to become, he'll love a uniform.
He will.
Fair to say.
But you know what? It doesn't actually end there. So I was having a look at there's a guy called John Rule who wrote this Titanic.
He hates the Kaiser,
He hates the Kaiser, but he basically devoted about 1,000 years of his life to writing about the Kaiser in this 6 million page trilogy. And he talks in that about basically when the Kaiser was a little boy. I mean, he wasn't the Kaiser then. When Wilhelm was a little boy, his doctors twice a week would plunge his arm, now this will sound weird, into the body of a freshly slaughtered hare.
Why?
In order to impart it. They would put his arm in because they thought it would impart his arm with the vigour and vitality of this dead hare.
I'm really surprised by that, because I had Germany down as the home of cutting edge science and medicine.
What you're forgetting, Tom, is it is also the home of horrendous spas and spa treatments.
I haven't forgotten that. I mean, people who listen to our episode on the Night of the Long Knives will know that we love a spa town in a German political tragedy. Yeah. But, I mean, that really is something that's quite Spartan.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem the cutting edge of early 20th century science, which is what I would associate Germany with.
It's 1860s Prussia, I don't know.
I suppose it is, yes. I suppose it is earlier. But
also, they've got other things. They've got more, are you after more advanced progressive medicine?
What else do they do?
They've got it. They've got a machine for stretching your head. So they would put this, when he was like a toddler, they would put him in this machine and sort of, I don't know, it's the opposite of it's the opposite of a head compressor. I can imagine a vice. Oh. It's the opposite of a vice. It kind of stretches your head out. Anyway, they've got that. That didn't do him any good.
Heath Robinson device.
Yeah, Heath Robinson device. It didn't do him any good.
Scatty-haired professors with glasses.
For years, he's got this pungent pus oozing from his right ear. And basically, it oozed continually until his late 30s, when eventually they said, look, his eardrum's got to go. And they took his eardrum out. So basically, he's been
I'm really starting to feel sympathy for him.
And if you're not feeling sympathy already, his mother, Vicky, British but behaves very poorly, because she said to him, "You're a cripple. Your conversation, is beneath you." He was 5 years old when she told him this, and then she said, she used to say to him, "No lady will ever have you with your black." I can't even say this. But she used to say, "No lady will ever have you with your black finger."
What's his black finger?
I think that's his arm.
Oh.
I think that's his arm. But imagine saying
that's not good parenting, is it?
To your son. I mean, that's mad. So he has these incredibly autocratic...
He must have very bad mental health.
He's very poor mental health, because he also has these terrible tutors who force him to work. He has to start work at 6 o'clock in the morning and work all the way through till 10 o'clock at night. Now, Tom, you and I do that now, preparing episodes of The Rest is History.
Yes, forced to do it.
But we didn't do that when we were 7. Theo didn't make us do that when he was 7.
Well, Theo wasn't born at that point, to be fair.
So you said about the Kaiser's mental health. He once said to one of his friends, "Something is missing in me that other people have. All poetic feeling in me has been dead and has been killed."
God, he really needs better help.
He does need, he definitely does. He needs, their access to licensed therapists. But also, Tom, did you see this? Christopher Clark, who's also a biographer of the Kaiser, but more sympathetic than John Rule, talks in his book, The Sleepwalkers, about the Kaiser's, what he calls his insane burblings.
Is this, so in your notes, you have this under a heading, which is in black print, so I won't miss it. The Tom Holland of the diplomatic world. I don't know what you mean by that. What are you saying? Are you saying I love a scheme? Burblings?
You love a scheme. You love a wheeze. You love an inane burble. Do I?
Okay.
Would you deny that? Can you look me in the eye and deny that, Tom?
I don't think they're inane burblings. I think they're to the point.
Well, I mean, the Kaiser suggested. I'll tell you about his insane burblings. In the late 1890s, he suggested founding a German colony in the middle of Brazil in the Amazon rainforest called New Germany, and he told everybody to encourage immigration. Everyone ignored him, obviously. Then he in 1899, so just a few years later, he said, actually, I've changed my mind. I think we should have a German colony in Mesopotamia, in the desert in Mesopotamia. He tried to partition China in 1900. 3 years after that, he suddenly stunned his aides by saying, Latin America is our target. And he ordered the Admiralty to prepare invasion plans of Cuba, Puerto Rico, and New York.
Okay, I mean, that's all very interesting, but I still want to come back to in what way is that like me?
Mad schemes, mad, ill thought out schemes, Tom. I think that's the claim. Do you not want to do a podcast about Chatham High Street?
I do, and we're going to. That's the difference.
Yeah.
Because none of these things happened, but we are going to be doing an episode on Chatham High Street.
Right. Well, anyway, so he's always come up with alliance projects as well. So he will say, listen, Chris Clark has a very amusing list with Russia and France against Japan and Britain, with Japan and the United States against Britain, Russia and France, with China and the United States against Japan and Russia. You know, he's like a man with a load of cards and he's mixing them up. And what he will do is...
But to be fair, Dominic, to be fair to anyone who's played the game diplomacy, I mean, this could be quite kind of shrewd. This is what you do in the game. You're constantly making alliances and then stabbing people in the back.
He loves this, you see. And what he will do, Wilhelm, is he will have his dinner parties. We talked once in our History's Most Disastrous Parties episode about his disastrous hunting trip with Dietrich Graf von Hulsen-Hesler, who dressed up as a ballerina and died in mid-pirouette. So these people will gather, and when they're dressing as ballerinas and dying, the Kaiser is saying to them, why don't we team up with the Portuguese and invade Paraguay? You know, he'll be just wittering this nonsense. Chris Clark says he was an extreme exemplar of that Edwardian social category, the club bore who is forever explaining some pet project to the man in the next chair. And of course, the man in the next chair is usually, because he's the Kaiser of Germany, the man in the next chair is usually a visiting royal, a head of state,
ambassador, that kind of thing. Yeah,
who will always be horrified. There's a great King Ferdinand of Bulgaria, who was actually German. The Kaiser smacked him on the bottom in public. And apparently he left Berlin white hot with hatred at having been so humiliated.
I'm feeling fonder and fonder of the Kaiser with each anecdote.
King Leopold of the Belgians, so this is the Leopold who disgraced himself in the Congo. He went to Berlin for the Kaiser's birthday party. And the Kaiser said to him at that, thought it was amusing banter to say, I fancy having a crack at the French. Would you like to, if you join me, I will give you the crown of old Burgundy. And Leopold was so upset by this, apparently, that when he left the party, he'd wearing his helmet the wrong way round. So
I just think he's being a snowflake there.
But of course, the Kaiser's great target is Britain. Now, he is half British by blood. So you could say, what's going on there? And the answer is obvious. He hated his parents, who were real Anglophiles, because they'd been putting his head into machines and forcing his arm into the dead body of a hare.
And do you think he associates this with Britain?
Yeah, I think he thinks Britain is
torture by medical contraptions.
I think he associates
this is the British way of parenthood.
Everything. I think the great thing with the Kaiser that makes him so entertaining a character is that on the one hand, he clearly worships Britain. He thinks Britain is the exemplar. He thinks he wants to go yachting with British officers.
And this is the whole point of the wrong shoes at cows stuff.
Yeah.
Is that he does not want to be snubbed by the British.
No.
He wants to be admired by them. And actually he is quite admired by the British, isn't he? So at the funeral of Edward VII, with who Wilhelm really hates.
He called him Satan.
Yes, well, there you go. I mean, that's hatred. But he gets the loudest cheers from the crowd.
Yeah. He's a character, you see. The British love a character, don't they?
Yeah.
He's often disgracing himself in Britain because he will turn up and he gave a disastrous interview to the Daily Telegraph, I believe, in which he said the English are as mad as March hares. They don't like me, but they should love and respect me. They're absolutely mad, I tell you, mad. And they printed this, and it was incredibly embarrassing. And basically, this was one of the many occasions when his own Foreign Office sort of banned him from giving more interviews because they said he's totally unreliable. But he's always, I think what it is, as I said, he's Queen Victoria's oldest grandchild. Britain is, as it were, to some extent, the mother country. He wants his own country, Germany, to be taken seriously. He wants to be taken seriously himself when he goes to Britain. And the whole wrong shoes thing, there is a sense that everybody is laughing at him the whole time. And of course, for somebody who basically is still the little boy who, his left arm is useless, he has been hideously tortured by his doctors, all of that, you can absolutely understand why that would eat away at your self-confidence.
It's also the kind of the languid period, isn't it, of Britain's affectation of effortless superiority, which is expressed in the men's tailoring and everything that we were talking about in our episode on that, and the yachting and the regattas, and Britain is setting the rules on how people at the top end of society should behave. And clearly this is something that burns the Kaiser up.
Yeah, absolutely it does, Tom. Now, does all this matter? That's the question. Does this matter in this series? Now, if you're John Rule, his biographer, you say it does matter, that the Kaiser is eaten up by hatred and has become a monstrous figure, a bully and a braggart, and that he will direct policy. On the other hand, even historians who are quite tough on Germany, someone like Max Hastings, he says ultimately the Kaiser is quite a comic figure. He is a uniformed version of Kenneth Graham's Mr. Toad. And the thing is, the Kaiser is not a dictator and he's not an absolute monarch. And there are lots of examples, often very amusing, of his staff just completely ignoring to him, laughing at him behind his back.
So this is why you're comparing him to me. Thanks.
No, not at all, Tom.
I will have my revenge, Dominic, even if it plunges Goldhanger into world war.
Not at all. Did you see this wonderful story about him writing a letter to Theodore Roosevelt in 1908? So he wrote a letter to Theodore Roosevelt, and the German ambassador refused to give it to Roosevelt. And he said in private to the other ambassadors, "It's not appropriate for the Emperor of Germany to write to the President of the United States as an infatuated schoolboy might write to a pretty seamstress." So, wow. I don't know what was in the letter.
Scorching stuff.
Anyway, the one thing we can say about the Kaiser that is admirable, he is a great friend, as we talked about in our Sarajevo series, of Franz Ferdinand and Sophie. So when other people are snubbing Sophie because she's only a duchess or whatever she was, countess, the Kaiser is actually really good on this. And the Kaiser says, no, you can come as equals to my castle. We can shoot loads of birds together. And
I think, again, that in that way, he is quite like me.
Really? Kind.
Yeah,
ultimately a kind person.
Ultimately a kind person. I don't stand on ceremony when I invite people to shooting parties on my Scottish estate.
Don't. No, you don't.
They're frightfully common.
It's one thing I've often said about you, that you will associate with people from all backgrounds, won't you?
I certainly will.
Lovely.
And also the other thing I love is, of course, is a yachting holiday in the Baltic.
And he
loves that as well.
Well, he's on one.
Actually,
he's on one when he finds out the terrible news that his friend Franz Ferdinand and Sophie have been murdered. So he is, on the afternoon of Sunday the 28th of June, he's in the Baltic on his yacht in the Kiel Regatta. And the Kiel Regatta is actually a brilliant place of kind of Anglo-German friendship. There's lots of kind of drinking of toasts and bants and shaking hands. And
you see, I do like the way that yachts will be appearing regularly throughout the build-up to the First World War.
Oh, good.
This is another example of it.
Yeah. Well, this exactly. So he learns the news in a very Edwardian yachting way. So he's about to set off on his yacht, and a motor launch comes alongside, blowing its horn urgently. And on the motor launch is Admiral Georg von Müller, who is the head of his naval cabinet. And he throws up his cigarette case. And a guy catches the cigarette case, opens it. It's a note for the Kaiser, and it says, Franz Ferdinand and Sophie have been murdered. And the Kaiser, the blood drains from his face. He turns pale and he says, I don't know why he says this, but this is what he says. He says, everything has to start again. And he's very upset. He's genuinely, I think often when people tell this story, even very great historians who write this story, sometimes forget that the Kaiser is not just a joke. He is actually a human being. And that this was one of his only friends. And he's genuinely upset about it and troubled.
And is a fellow royal who's been assassinated.
Yeah.
So that must also kind of play on his mind.
In a world when, royals are often being assassinated, right? So it's a frightening thing. So we know that he scribbles in the days after the assassination, the Serbs need to be sorted out. This is something that is on his mind. On the other hand, he's written that about almost every country in Europe in the last 10 years or so. And the thing with the Kaiser is he's very bellicose, and he's always coming up with these mad ideas, podcasts about Chatham High Street, you name it. However, he actually has no record of starting a war. He has never invaded anybody. He's never attacked another European country. The Germans have been involved in Southwest Africa very horrifically. But that campaign, actually, they'd got there, they'd started all that business before he even became emperor. And, of course, all European countries are behaving badly in Africa. The Kaiser,
and in the context of Europe, he's friends with Franz Ferdinand, who is a
peace advocate.
Peace.
A peace advocate. He has repeatedly sided with Franz Ferdinand about that. And he once made a joke to Franz Ferdinand. He said, "You Austrians, I wish you'd stop rattling with my sabre." As in...
Yeah, very good.
You know...
So I'm also a man of peace, Dominic.
Yeah. So
again,
the parallels,
another point of resemblance.
There's very much a Franz Ferdinand Wilhelm II vibe at the heart of this podcast, isn't there? Do you not think?
Yeah, I think there is.
I think the Kaiser is actually quite typical of a lot of the Germans in this period. So we will talk in a later episode about the chief of their chief general, the man who masterminds the opening German campaigns of the First World War, who is General Helmut von Moltke the Younger. Moltke has always said to the Austrians, if there is ever a war, we will stand beside you, but don't start it. Please don't start a war. We'll be there for you. One day the Teutons and the Slavs will fight it out. Of course, loads of people believe this in the late 19th, early 20th century because it's the age of kind of racial thinking and social Darwinist thinking. But Moltke had said explicitly, there will one day be a war, which will be a struggle between Germandom and Slavdom, but the attack must come from the Slavs, i.e., let them start it, but we can't start it. So that is the situation. In fact, the Austrians, as they're sitting there, surrounded by Sascha Torte, with their enormous moustaches, saying, let's have a crack at the Serbs, their big worry is the Germans will let us down. The Germans are all talk, and they'll never follow through. They love dreaming up wars against invasions of Bolivia.
Well, I mean that traditionally has been the image of the Germans, that they are kind of dreamy idealists, and I guess there's a kind of legacy of that. Maybe. Even as they kind of go, attacking the French and so on.
But the Austrians are absolutely set on this. General Conrad, Count von Berchtold, they are, they think if we do not take this chance now, it is the end of our empire. And actually, I think they also think we owe it to Franz Ferdinand. That, sure, he was a man of peace, and he gave the Serbs every possible latitude, and they rewarded him for it by murdering him, and now we have to avenge him. And so they decide that they're going to... Count Berchtold says, I'm going to send my chief of staff. He's a younger guy. He's called Count Alexander Hoyos. He's young, but he's very experienced, and he's a kind of hardliner. I will send Hoyos to Berlin to discuss with the Germans in person. And they give him 2 documents. One is a kind of general memorandum. The other is a personal letter from the Emperor Franz Joseph to the Kaiser, explaining exactly what he wants. And it's on that letter, Tom, that the fortunes of Europe will turn.
Right. So let's finish today's episode. And in the next episode, you can find out what the impact of those 2 letters are on the Kaiser, on the alliance between Germany and Austria, and by extension, how people who are opposed to Germany and Austria in Russia, in France, and even in Britain will react.
I sincerely regret that you should have been obliged to give up your intention of going to Vienna for the funeral ceremonies. I should have liked personally to express to you my sincerest thanks for your sympathy in my keen sorrow, a sympathy which has greatly touched me. By your warm and sympathetic condolence, you have given me renewed proof that I have in you a true and reliable friend, and that even in the darkest hours of trial, I can always count on you. The attack directed against my poor nephew is the direct consequence of the agitation carried on by the Russian and Serbian pan-Slavists, whose only aim is the weakening of the Triple Alliance and the destruction of my empire. At the heart of the Sarajevo affair was not just the single bloody deed of an individual, but a well-organized conspiracy, the threads of which reached to Belgrade, which constitutes a constant danger to my family and to my realm. After the latest terrible events in Bosnia, you must surely agree that we cannot live any longer with this Serbian antagonism, and that as long as this furnace of criminal agitation at Belgrade goes unpunished, all European monarchies are in danger.
So that, Dominic, was Emperor Franz Joseph, the 436-year-old Austro-Hungarian emperor, writing to the Kaiser Wilhelm II, and he wrote that letter on the 2nd of July 1914.
Guten Tag, everybody, or should I say Grüß Gott, since we are in Österreich. That was very nice, Franz Joseph.
Thank you.
I enjoyed that a lot. I worried.
Did you like the kind of modulated range of emotion?
I did.
He starts off calm, and then he gets more and more irate as he gets furious with the thought of these Serbian conspirators.
Yeah, the furnace of conspiracy, or whatever he calls it, the furnace of criminal agitation. Very stirring stuff. Yes. So last time we were really focused on Austria, how there were lots of people in Austria, especially the chief of their general staff, General Franz Conrad von Hötzendorf, and the foreign minister, Count Berchtold, who have long been thinking about what to do about Serbia and been thinking about a preemptive strike. And now, of course, they have their chance. But I think, as we said last time, important to say, the assassination of Franz Ferdinand and Sophie is not just a pretext. It is something they take very seriously in and of itself. So Franz Joseph, where he says there, the threat to my realm and my family, I mean, he really believes that.
Of course.
I mean, his wife has been murdered by an anarchist. His son took his own life in a weird suicide pact. His nephew has now been shot by a Bosnian terrorist.
His brother was killed by Mexican revolutionaries.
Yes. So
danger
life
everywhere.
Yeah. So he genuinely sees that sense of being embattled and encircled. I mean, a lot of the participants in this story feel this, but I think it's important to say the Austrians absolutely do feel it, and you get a sense of that, I think, in that wonderful reading that you did, Tom.
Thank you.
So we also talked last time about the Kaiser, didn't we? About the person who's going to be reading this letter. But let's concentrate for a second on how the letter gets there. So on the 5th of July, so we are now a week after the assassination, the 5th of July, which is a Sunday, Count Alex Hoyos, he's a sort of younger Austrian diplomat. But
I misranked him then. I apologise to him.
What did you call him?
Hare.
Yeah, you did call him Hare, but I thought that was...
Sorry.
No, that's all right. I mean, if the Hoyos family are listening, they can take it up with you.
I apologise unreservedly.
Oh, that's kind of you, Tom. You don't want another Dr. Valverde imbroglio, do you?
No, I don't.
So Count Hoyos arrives in Berlin, and it's absolutely deserted. And the reason is it's the summer. Everybody's on holiday. So the Chancellor of Germany, Theobald Bethmann Hollweg, is away on his country estate. The head of the army, the chief of the general staff, Helmut von Moltke the younger, he has a problem with his liver, and he is off taking the waters in Carlsbad.
Of course he is.
Because,
as we have already discovered, key events in 20th century German history all involve spa towns.
In Carlsbad, which is now in the Czech Republic. And the Kaiser himself is actually getting ready for his holiday. He will be going probably tomorrow or the next day on his trip to the Norwegian fjords. So he always loves a Baltic cruise. The Kaiser, he loves yachting. Of course, Tom, as we have established.
Bit of a smorgasbord.
Yeah, he loves all that. He likes the bracing Baltic waters. I've been to that neck of the woods and was attacked by a jellyfish. I don't know whether the Kaiser would.
We'll come to my interaction with the events of the Kaiser's yachting holiday in due course. So that's something for people to look forward to.
That is exciting. So first of all, Count Hoyos goes to see an old friend of his called Arthur Zimmermann. And if we have American listeners, that name may ring one or two bells, because Arthur Zimmermann later, in a few years, will write a very consequential telegram that brings the United States into the war. But at the time, he's the kind of coming man in the Foreign Office there. They're old China hands. So they had been in China during the Boxer Rebellion, 1900. So they have a little chat about China and all that kind of thing, Hoyos and Zimmermann. And Hoyos is very frank to Zimmermann. And he says, look, I've got these letters. I'm looking forward to handing them over, getting the Kaiser to see them. Personally, he says, I would like to see us hit Serbia really hard and actually just wipe it out. Let's partition Serbia among ourselves, the Austrians, the Bulgarians and the Albanians. He says, actually, Serbia must be destroyed. It's very kind of Carthago delenda est. He just says, we have to be really hard line about this. But actually, Hoyos is not going to get to see the Kaiser himself. The man who's going to see the Kaiser is the Austrian ambassador. Now, Tom, I was very harsh on you last time by making you read the name.
Okay.
But I won't. I was going to say I won't make you do it this time.
Do you want me to do it? Have a crack?
You can have a crack.
I mean, it's just... So this is... Hungarian is famously with Finnish.
Yeah.
And Basque, the most difficult languages for
Yeah.
Indo-European speakers to master. And this gives a demonstration why. So this, the Austrian ambassador is Count Laszlo Szygényi, marriage de Magyar Szygien et Szolgozsás. I mean, it's like a jumble of Scrabble.
I think,
pieces.
I'm not much better, to be honest. I did try to look this up. He's actually called Count Laszlo Szygényi, marriage de Magyar Szygien et Szolgozsás. Anyway.
Apologies to Hungarian listeners.
He's Count Szygényi. I think Count Szygényi is how we'd call him. So Count Szygényi is the Austro-Hungarian ambassador. He is obviously, as you can tell from that, a Magyar. He is kind of the head boy of the Berlin diplomatic corps. So because obviously the Austrians are very close to the Germans. Everyone kind of slightly defers to him among the other ambassadors. He is very popular. The Kaiser loves him. The Kaiser's always playing jokes and japes on him. And and the Kaiser calls him, "You are my gypsy, my little gypsy," and all this kind of stuff because of his Hungarianness, which that he pretends to enjoy. So he's given these two documents, and he goes to the Kaiser's palace in Potsdam to hand them over. Now, it is a sign, as Thomas Otte points out in his book July Crisis, of just how unseriously the Germans have prepared for this, that nobody has briefed the Kaiser before the ambassador comes. Nobody has told him, if this was the United States right now, he would have a little piece of paper. He'd be Joe Biden, and he'd have a piece of paper with bullet points telling him what they want, what we want, where we want to get to. The Kaiser has nothing like this.
But also, just to ask you, if Germany was the Germany of, I guess, popular perception, that it's full of shaven-headed Prussians plotting the invasion of Belgium.
Yeah.
And they're just looking for an opportunity. That's clearly not the case here. They're not, they haven't thought, oh, brilliant, this is a chance for us to invade France.
Oh, no, I would say not at all. Now, maybe some people listening to this will say, oh, gosh, Sandbrook and Holland are going very easy on the Germans here. This is very poor form. But I think it's no historian who's really studied this in detail would make that claim. Because Wilhelm has spent that morning in our Sarajevo series. We had that those lovely scenes of him and Franz Ferdinand bonding over their rhododendrons. Remember that? Yeah. So the Kaiser has actually been doing that this morning. He's gone and he's been admiring the rose bushes in his Potsdam garden. And then he went to they'd put on a special exhibition for him of works by a kind of historical painter called Professor Scherbel. And the Kaiser has been looking at all these paintings of scenes from German history. Oh, lovely, lovely paintings, nice roses. And then he goes in for this meeting with the Austrian ambassador. And it's not like there's the whole apparatus of the German war machine behind him. There's nobody there. There's just the two of them. So Szygényi hands over these two documents. Now, one of them is basically just a sort of quite boring strategic overview of the Austria's position in the Balkans. And the second one is the one you read out at the beginning. So that was the letter from Franz Joseph. It has been...
And that's the personal appeal.
It's the personal appeal. It's been very carefully drafted by the Austrian Foreign Ministry. And it's an appeal to the Kaiser on the principle of our great friendship, your friendship with Franz Ferdinand, and the principle of monarchical solidarity.
Yeah.
No European monarchy is safe with these crazy terrorists running around. And Wilhelm looks at all this, and actually at first he's pretty calm. He doesn't start shouting, "Let's invade Argentina" or something in his traditional way. I shall get out the crown of Burgundy and give it to the Belgians. Yeah. None of this nonsense. He actually says, "Listen, I completely understand where you're coming from. You've suffered a terrible provocation." And he says, "That said, I understand why you want a serious action against Serbia, but there is a risk of a serious European complication to this.
Because Serbia is aligned with Russia.
So we'll kind of have a think about it. I need to talk to my Chancellor, Bethmann Hollweg." So again, the idea that the Kaiser is an absolute monarch, or he's a bully and everybody lives in his shadow, it's not quite right. The Kaiser knows he has to talk to the civilian leaders.
But they then go and have lunch, don't they? And then after lunch, he starts to kind of Kaiser a bit.
Yeah, he does, exactly. So they have this lunch. God knows what they have at the lunch that gets him into this. I think he's just been
something very hot.
He's just been thinking about it. His friend has been killed, all of this stuff. And he's sort of worked himself up. So when they reconvene after lunch, he says to the ambassador, Sergeni, he says, "Actually, do you know what? I completely understand why you want to have a crack at the Serbs. And I've been thinking about it, and you have my absolute full support. I will talk to the Chancellor, Bethmann Hollweg, but he's bound to agree with me. And you know what as well? You shouldn't hang about. You should strike quickly." The Russian,
well, that's an important point,
it's
isn't
a
it?
really important point.
He's not wrong with that.
He's not wrong at all. He says, listen, the Russians will make a huge hullabaloo about this. There's no question about that. However, I'm pretty confident the Russians won't do anything stupid. We will stand by you, so that will deter them. The Russians don't want war. They're not prepared for war. It'll probably be fine. And again, he repeats at the end, the current moment is the most advantageous one. It would be a massive mistake not to exploit it. This is the best chance you'll ever have.
Right. So never let a crisis go to waste.
Never let a crisis go to waste. But you don't want this shock of the crisis to completely dissipate.
Yeah.
I think every historian would say the Kaiser's not wrong there. This is the obvious moment.
We talked about that in the previous episode.
Yeah, exactly.
The longer you leave it, the less the sense of international outrage fades.
Right, exactly. So the question, therefore, is this: what is the Kaiser thinking? What's going on in the Kaiser's head? Is this because he dreams of world conquest and like fighting all his enemies and a world war in which Germany will be victorious? I think there is no evidence of that. I think the Kaiser, he is specifically saying to the Austrian guy, there won't be a world war. So this is your chance to kind of crack on and do it.
But also he has flagged up the fact that the risk is of provoking Russia.
He's aware there's a
bad, and this is a bad thing.
Yeah, exactly. That it's a bad thing and preferably a thing you'd want to avoid by deterrence. Yeah. Is he being motivated here by his famous hostility to and loathing of the British? Absolutely not. The British are never mentioned at all. Really, I think what this is it's his textbook. Kaiser, he's had his lunch. Whenever he has lunch with visiting dignitaries, he loses it and just starts ranting. This is what he has done. And as Thomas Otti says, there is a personal dimension. I mean, it's so easily overlooked. This is his friend who was killed. And he takes it very seriously. And he thinks they should be punished. Why would you not punish them? So the meeting breaks up. And then the Kaiser goes out to the garden. And there some of his sort of bigwigs are waiting, including the Prussian war minister, who is called Erich von Falkenhayn. And he says to them, guys, the Austrians look like they're going to gear up for a war against Serbia. And they all say, yeah, I can understand that. That's fair enough. And actually, the Kaiser's adjutant, who's a guy called Hans von Plessen, he writes a diary, which is a brilliant source for us, gives us a real sense of what they're thinking. Here, the view prevails that the sooner the Austrians strike against Serbia, the better, and the Russians, although friends of Serbia, would not join in after all.
So again, the emphasis on speed.
Speed, exactly. Then, now the key person, really, the Kaiser needs to persuade, if he's keen on this, is the Chancellor. The Chancellor has just got back from his country estate. He is Theobald Bethmann Hollweg. Now, because he's the leader of Germany and because he's got a beard, he's very easy to caricature as this sort of Mephistopheles figure. Yeah. And he's absolutely not that at all. He's like all those
British ministers whose idea of fun is to go off and read Plato in Greek.
That's exactly
he's absolutely what he's up to.
That's genuinely what he's been doing. I mean, he genuinely has been reading Plato in Greek because his wife has just died after a long illness, Bethmann Holweg's wife, and he's very melancholy, and he's been reading Plato. In Britain, people regarded him as quite an admirable person, a sort of moderate. He's a moderate conservative. He's not a super reactionary. He's from a Frankfurt kind of law and banking family. Richard Haldane, who'd been Britain's Secretary of State for War in the Edwardian period, said he was the Abraham Lincoln of Germany. You know, an admirable man, measured, sensible, cultured, all of this kind of thing. And Bethmann Holweg, when he listens, the Kaiser explains what's going on, he says, yeah, I mean, fair enough. We'll stand by the Austrians. That'll work to deter the Russians. Let them have their crack at Serbia. So they're all agreed. The next morning, Monday the 6th, the Kaiser goes off on holiday. So I think there are some historians who say this is a sign of just how sinister and Machiavellian the Germans are, that they all go on holiday to fool everybody into thinking there's not going to be a world war. I think the Germans don't think there's going to be a world war, and so they go on holiday. And the Kaiser
doesn't the Kaiser say, as a reason for thinking this, that the Tsar won't side with regicides?
Yeah, he does.
So ultimately, the Russians will kick up a fuss, but because of that detail, because he can't imagine Nicky backing regicides, it will be all right.
Absolutely, he thinks that, Tom. I don't think you can make sense of what happens in all this without thinking that the Germans and the Austrians, like the Russians later on, but the Germans and Austrians genuinely think they're in the right. They think that virtue and decency and reason are on their side, and that the reasonable person will look at their case and say, fair enough. Regicides have to be punished. Terrorism cannot be allowed to flourish unchecked. All of this kind of thing.
Well, we're familiar with that kind of...
With that kind of rhetoric.
That kind of argument, aren't we?
Of course we are. So this is effectively the Blanque Cheque. Because...
Right, so this is the famous Blanque Cheque.
Yeah, because the Chancellor, Bethmann, goes to see the ambassador, or they have a meeting, and he says, just to confirm everything the Kaiser has said to you, we will stand behind you, go for it, whatever happens. And it's your call. It's not our call, because it's not our business. It is your call, and whatever you decide, we are your friend, and we are with you.
But Dominic, just to be clear, the Germans basically don't think that they are giving a blank check, because they think that this will be a local war. They don't think that they're saying, yeah, we're with you and let's have a world war and brilliant.
No. We'll come to this, because this is a slightly more complicated issue. So,
and I ask that because probably people listening to this will be aware of something called the Schlieffen Plan. Mm-hmm. They'll be aware of kind of talk that Germany has been preparing for a war of conquest against France and against Russia, and has been embroiled in a naval race against Britain.
Yes.
So should we take a break at this point? And when we come back, let's look at each of those scenarios and find how accurate they are.
Tom, I would love nothing more than to take a break now, and we can talk about this when we come back.
Brilliant. Hello, welcome back to The Rest is History. Germany has just issued Austria the notorious Blanque Cheque. And Dominic, often this is, and I have to say that this is how I had always understood it, that this is essentially the expression of a German establishment that is keen for war. Mm. But having reread Christopher Clark's great book, The Sleepwalkers, in preparation for this, and having read all your notes, I'm now doubtful. So can we tease this myth?
Oh, Tom, I hate to be the person who sows doubt in your mind.
So first of all, Britain.
Yeah.
Because certainly here, the idea that the Kaiser is gagging for war because of various insults that he's received and so on. How accurate is that?
There has been Anglo-German antagonism, and when we get onto Britain in this story in a couple of episodes' time, we will talk about this in greater detail. But by and large, I don't think it's fair to say that there is any sense. I mean, actually, the general sense in 1914 is that relations haven't been brilliant, but they are now definitely on an upwards curve. We're getting along much better. There has been
a
naval competition.
You mentioned Haldane, this guy Haldane, the war minister, who had a mission in 1912, hadn't he?
Yes.
That had been aborted.
Yes, there had been efforts going back to the days of Joseph Chamberlain in British politics by people who said, we have a lot in common with the Germans. And actually, they would be a really good natural ally for us. And it just hasn't worked out for various reasons, small things, but also actually the British don't ultimately think they've got that much to gain from an alliance with Germany compared with an alliance with France and Russia, which will solve a lot of problems for them. Yeah. But by and large, most Germans are now working for good relations with Britain. They want good relations. There is no...
And the Kaiser... I mean, he's going off on his holiday on his yacht. And he's going to be hanging out with British officers at regattas, isn't he?
He is. So this is the curious thing with the Kaiser. Nobody in history has ever spoken more of how much their contempt for Britain than the Kaiser. But at the same time, he desperately wants Britain's admiration, affection, respect, and all those kinds of things. He wants the British to be his friend and to take him seriously. And when they don't, he's full of bitterness and anger. But I don't think there was any sense whatsoever. I mean, we will see throughout this story, actually, the last thing, let's be honest, the last thing that most German policymakers, including people in the military, want is war with Britain, because they don't want to have to face the British Navy and the British economy and British industry and the empire and all of that kind of stuff. What is a different story is Russia. Lots of Germans think that war with Russia in the long run is inevitable. So they've grown up in that world of the late 19th century where people talk in terms of races and inevitable racial struggles and all of that kind of...
Teutons against Slavs.
Teutons against Slavs. And they think, well, this is inevitable. It will come one day. And they are conscious that they think that every day that passes, the odds turn more and more against them, because Russia is this enormous country with a massive army, double the size of the German army. It's getting bigger all the time, but also Russia, hitherto very backward, is modernizing, industrializing, building railways, rearming, all of this stuff. Yeah. And to give you a small example, in the summer of 1914, the Kaiser read an article in a Russian newspaper that had been planted by the Russian War Ministry. And it was a boastful article about how they were rearming and how they had all this modern equipment and they were going to have a massive army in a few years' time that would be 3 times bigger than Germany's army. And he writes in the margin, and he says, the Russians have put their cards on the table. He says anybody who thinks that the Russians and their French friends are not planning a war against us should be in a lunatic asylum.
Right, so Russia is in alliance with France.
Yes.
We should just remind people of that as well. Which is why, of course,
Tom, the Germans feel encircled, because they look west and there's the French, they look east and there's the Russians. And that's...
So really, their only allies, great power allies, is Austria-Hungary.
Yeah.
And even with the Austro-Hungarian army, they're still outnumbered by the Russians on their own, and excluding France, let alone Britain.
I'm glad you raised that point, because, of course, what that tells you is that's one reason why they issue that blank cheque, because they have only one real reliable friend. And if you have only one friend and you don't stand by that one friend, then you have no friends.
Right. And this, of course, will be a consideration for Britain in relation to France. So these are also important factors in explaining what happens.
Yes, absolutely. I think to me, the really striking thing about the Germans before 1914, there is a lot of strutting and a lot of where spikes on helmets and all that sort of stuff. But actually the really striking thing is the general mood is one of pessimism and melancholy and a kind of fatalism. So Bethmann Hollweg, the Chancellor, one of his aides, there's an incredible diary entry just a couple of days later, 7th of July. And he says, yesterday I was with the Reich Chancellor, and he talks, we were in his old chateau, the great trees. There's a massive sense he hasn't got over his wife's death, a melancholy and a restraint in landscape and people. And he says they talked about the world situation. Russia's military power growing rapidly. Austria continually weakening and more immobile. Austria, our last decent ally. In general, blindness all around, a thick fog over the people. The future belongs to Russia, which grows and grows and becomes for us an ever more oppressive nightmare.
I know that this is very complicated, and that lots of historians now say that there was no such thing, but the Schlieffen Plan.
Yeah.
This kind of idea that there should be a war, a rapid war against France to knock France out, and then you turn your forces and go to Russia.
Yeah.
and that this kind of rapid war, because you have to bring France to defeat very early, would necessitate the German army moving through Belgium.
Yeah.
Is this a thing? Are they talking about it? Are they preparing for it? Because that's very much, I think, the vague sense that people might have in their heads.
It's a complicated question, but the first thing to say is everybody has plans. So the French have plans. You have bureaucratized militaries in a way that you maybe didn't have 100 years earlier, where they do, they have exercises, they have maneuvers, they have very complicated strategies and tactics that they have worked out. Warfare has become intellectualized, I guess. And as a result of that, they do have war scenarios and plans drawn up. And obviously, if you are the Germans, you have to fight one of those two people first, either France or Russia. And their sense is France is the more dangerous adversary because it's much more industrialized and much more modern. We have to deal with them first, and then we turn back to this great lumbering Leviathan,
behemoth in the east
of Russia in the east. But basically, if we've already knocked out France, we just do what we can then on the Eastern Front, and eventually we'll beat the Russians. And that's the way of doing it. Are they planning to launch this plan? Are they itching to get started? I think that is the wrong way of looking at it, because they are so gloomy. And a lot of them, when they talk about a future war, which they do all the time, the German generals, they think a war is coming, but when they talk about it, they're not. What are you going to wear at the victory parade? For its kind of
this incredible vein of fatalism.
Yeah, it's like we are facing.
Basically, it amazed me reading what von Moltke and all these other German generals, when they talk about the prospect of war, and they do kind of say, it's inevitable, we're going to have it, but they're not doing it really in any tone of triumphalism. It's kind of, we're probably going to be defeated and annihilated, but it's better to go down fighting kind of tone.
Yeah, I think so, because they're looking all the time at Russia, and they're thinking, the Russians, the time to fight the Russians was 1890 or something. In 1920, the Russians will be so much more industrialized, and they'll have fantastic railways, and the French will lend them all this money to buy new guns and stuff. And if there is, as they think, an inevitable racial conflict coming between Teuton and Slav, they think there's a lot more Slavs than there are us. And, the law of nature is struggle, and we're for the chop.
So at this point, are there members of the German staff who think this is a chance to beat Russia while we have the opportunity? If we leave it a few more years, then we'll be doomed. We might as well crack on.
Again, a complicated question, Tom. Sorry to give you a very nuanced answer, because I know we hate nuanced answers on the rest of history. So what do they? Well, here's the thing. What do they think will happen? Some of them think the Austrians won't actually follow through with this. So I mentioned Erich von Falkenhayn, who later becomes the German kind of supreme commander for a brief time in the First World War. Falkenhayn says, the Austrians are all talk, but ultimately, it's all just cakes and Mozart with them. They're not going to follow through with this. Then most of the people think the Austrians will actually follow through this time, but the Russians won't join in. Now, there are some people who say, but of course, they're not idiots, right? They think there's always a chance the Russians might join in. But they say, well, listen, if that happens, there is no better time than now. So you can understand the logic of that. That's in our own lives, we will have had situations where we say, I don't really want this to happen, but if it is going to happen, well, better to do it now than to do it later. It's a little bit like that stupid thing that people say when you're in a football tournament and you say, well, we don't want to draw Brazil in the second round. And then somebody says, yeah, but you've got to play them at some point, haven't you? Better to play them early on when they might be, So that's
undercooked.
Basically the way they think about the Russians. We don't really want to be drawn against them, but we've got to play them at some point, so why not now? Let's just do it. And I think they think if the Russians do get stuck in now, that will prove that they hate us, and they were always going to do that.
Yeah.
So we just have to. It's better to do it now, actually.
But it's a defensive. It's essentially a defensive mentality, even though they're planning a war of aggression. And this is a paradox that runs throughout the
Yeah,
build-up
it's
to
so
the
Tom,
outbreak
it's
of the
such
war.
a good point. And actually, we've done obviously series about the rise of the Nazis, and I don't think you understand the mentality in Germany after the war unless you realise that the Germans genuinely thought they were fighting a defensive war. I mean, all their rhetoric when the war starts is, "We have been forced to draw the sword. We didn't want to. We are surrounded." That sense that you mentioned of being encircled and the Schlieffen Plan is their way out, that's massively, massively important to them, and their sense of right being on their side. Nobody whatsoever really in Germany in the Great War thinks we are the bad guys in this war. They think it's been forced upon them by a malevolent Russia. Anyway, at this point, they don't think there is going to be a world war, of course. Falkenhayn says to Wilhelm before Wilhelm's bags are packed and he's about to go off. He's got his yachting shoes and he's got all his stuff. And he says, "Shall I make some preparations just in case?" And Wilhelm explicitly says, No preparations for what? There isn't going to be a war. So off he goes on his Baltic cruise. Bethmann Hollweg, the Chancellor, he goes back to his country estate to kind of stroll among his oaks and think about Plato.
Plato, yeah.
General von Moltke has spent the whole time surrounded by hideous sulfuric waters, kind of being
Large men slapping his shoulders.
exactly terrible scenes, probably the worst scenes in this whole series of a German spa. So I think this now. Some people would say all very cunning from the Germans, of course. They're lulling everybody into but I don't think that's right at all. I think they genuinely don't think this is going to lead to a conflagration. So Hoyos returns. And the ambassador telegraphs back to Vienna, and the people in Vienna, they think this is absolutely brilliant, of course, because they've got the blank check. Do what you like. We're not even going to try and influence you. Now, a lot of historians would say very irresponsible of the Germans to give the Austrians this blank check, but for Berchtold and General Conrad, they say tremendous. Right, so. Shall we crack on and do it?
But they can't, can they? Because it's Austro-Hungary and everything takes
exactly
8 months to do anything.
Exactly. I mean, this is the weird thing, right? So Thomas Otte, in his book July Crisis, he's not generally very, he actually comes down at the end of this mammoth book. He is quite old school, and he blames the Austrians and the Germans for the First World War. But even in this book, he says, listen, if they had attacked Serbia, the next day, there would have been no world war.
Would they have been in a position to do that, though?
No.
So
they're disorganised.
It's an irrelevant argument, isn't it?
I suppose it is, but it makes the point that a shock has happened, and for the Austrians, the shock doesn't really fade. They're still nursing their sense of hurt.
But for everyone else,
for everybody else, it has faded. Now, their whole system, as you said, is actually, it's not just that it's slow by accident. It is built by design to be slow, because the whole basis of Austria-Hungary is a massive compromise. It's a compromise largely between Austria and Hungary, but also they have to take into account the Croats and the Slovenes and the Ukrainians and the Poles and all these other people in their empire. So everything proceeds in a very, very nuanced, negotiated, kind of conflict-avoiding, bureaucratic way. That's the way it works. It's a bit like the EU or something.
Yeah.
And as a result of that, you get to the 7th of July. They meet on the 7th of July, and they still don't make a decision because the Hungarian Prime Minister, who we talked about last time, István Tisza, he is still very reluctant. And he says, I think actually, do you know what? I know the Germans are kind of up for this, but I still think it would be better to have to humiliate Serbia diplomatically, rather than
the Kaiser's option of just occupying Belgrade. Everyone's forgotten about that.
No, this hasn't been raised at this point. So the Kaiser will bring that up later on.
Okay.
He'll say, why do you have to have a huge war? Why don't you just make a punitive expedition? And do you know what? The Kaiser gets he doesn't always get a lot of respect in this podcast, but this is probably the best idea the Kaiser ever had.
People ignore it. People think it's just him being mad again.
Yes, exactly.
Well,
exactly.
I have some sympathy with that.
We'll get it. Those Holland, Hohenzollern parallels again.
Just an endless stream of brilliant ideas that
that have dogged you ever since you started this podcast. Right. So on the 8th of July, we're now well over a week since the assassination. The Austrians draw up a new plan that they think will basically persuade Count Tisza, the Hungarian Prime Minister, and they say, look, here's what we'll do. We won't just attack Serbia. We will give them an ultimatum, listing all our grievances, and we will make an ultimatum, and I quote, with demands that Serbia can scarcely be willing to fulfill. Then either war or such a humiliation for Serbia that she is eliminated as a factor for some time. In other words, we'll give them this ultimatum, and they won't accept it probably. If they do accept it, they'll be completely humiliated. And if they don't accept it, we can strike them then. And you know what? Still, they don't do anything. Still the days go by because Tisza is now making up his mind. He's like, oh, I'll think about it. And he thinks about it for almost another week until finally, on the 14th of July, so we are now more than 2 weeks after the assassination, he goes to see the German ambassador and he says, well, I've made up my mind. Let's do this. So you think...
And do they?
Finally.
Do they go for it?
No, of course not.
Oh.
They're Austro-Hungary. Of course they don't do it. So now they have two other issues. One is their railway network is not built for swift mobilization. So at some point, I think they said to Conrad, well, great, you've been asking for this war for so long. When would you like to start it? He's like, 1916? You know, I mean, does it have to be this decade? No, he's
Dominic, just on the issue of mobilization.
Yeah,
important to talk about this because obviously this affects all the various combatants in the war.
Yeah,
that there are two issues, really, aren't there? So there's the railways.
Yes,
and isn't there? Was it Arthur? Who was it? Somebody said
AJP Taylor.
AJP Taylor said that it happens because the railway timetables can't be changed.
Yeah.
And the other thing is it's July, it's coming up to August, and this is harvest time.
Exactly.
And so that is a real problem if you're doing a mass mobilization, that you may risk the harvest.
Absolutely a massive issue, Tom. And both those things are really important. In an age of mechanized, partially mechanized, industrialized warfare, you need to get your men to the front. And you cannot afford to do that after somebody else. If they're at the front and you aren't, and you're trudging along the lanes, curtains, you're beaten.
Yeah.
So mobilizing your men, which means basically getting them moving, getting them to the front lines, is massively, massively important. And you cannot, if you are Germany, let's say, and you're looking at that massive Russian army, much bigger than yours, speed is the essence for you. You can't hang around, as we will see later on. The issue of the timetables and people going the wrong way on the network and all that stuff, that's actually really important. If you've set your army in train to go to basically commandeer the whole network and sending them off to the west, you can't then suddenly say, oh, actually, I've changed my mind.
East.
We'll go east. I mean, that's not how trains work. They can't.
But also you can see why a mobilization that precedes the mobilization of a potential adversary might be seen as a defensive measure by the person who's doing it.
Of course. We're mobilizing just in case. But of course, if your opponent mobilizes just in case, you can't not mobilize yourself because what if they then attack
It's
you?
kind of doomsday.
It is.
Doomsday machine.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's exactly that. Now, as you said, the other thing about the harvest, Austria-Hungary is a farming country. Huge, vast tracts of farms dominated by these big landowners and magnates who are often involved in politics. And they have basically persuaded the army to give their men farming leave so that in the summer, they'll all go back to their hometowns and they'll help with the harvest. And right now, Conrad says, everyone's like, great, finally we can do it. And he says, yeah, there is just one thing, actually. So in a lot of big places in the empire, Zagreb, Bratislava, Budapest, Krakow, the soldiers have all gone home. And they won't be back until the end of July. Now, he could recall them now, but if he did that, everybody in Europe would know that there's going to be a war. So he doesn't want to do that because that kind of gives the game away. And what is worse, they work out that the end of the harvest leave kind of overlaps with a state visit by the leaders of France to St. Petersburg between the 20th and the 23rd of July. And if they attack Serbia then Serbia's best pals will be together in St. Petersburg and will be able to coordinate their response perfectly. Which is, so from the Austrian point of view, that's obviously bonkers. You don't want to cause a great hullabaloo when they are actually having a summit, as it were, the French and the Russians, because they will be offended by it, but also they'll react to it straight away then and there. So they say, okay, well, fine. Well, we'll have to wait till we'll have to get everybody back from the harvest. Then we'll have to wait for the French to leave St. Petersburg. So actually, now that we look at it, the Thursday, the 23rd of July, which is the day the French leave St. Petersburg and the troops will be back from the harvest, that's when we'll deliver the ultimatum. And we'll give this.
So basically, by this point, everyone else has forgotten about the assassination.
Of course. We know how the news cycle works. It's no different in 1914. A month afterwards, it will almost be exactly a month that they'll give them the ultimatum. A month afterwards, that's yesterday's news.
Yeah.
So there's the issue that it's delayed and they've lost all the shock and the speed. The other thing that is absolutely astounding, and even though I am a bit of an Austrophile and a Habsburgophile. Yeah, I love a Sasha Torta, Tom. I love the music of Mahler. And
can I just say how thrilled I am to learn from your notes that Berchtold's private Viennese mansion was called the Strudelhof.
I know.
I mean, that's
what I love about this whole story.
So.
What's so satisfying improbable about this subject is that everybody behaves. I mean, it could not be
according to every stereotype going.
The Kaiser is sort of blustering, crying, and shouting at various points. When we introduce the British,
they're all fishing.
They're all playing bridge.
Yeah,
something. The French are just behaving in a Machiavellian way, but there's also enormous amount of stress with the French about their cuisine and about the details of banquet.
The soup.
The soup is the wrong soup.
Yeah.
All this stuff. And of course, the Austrians all live in the Strudelhof and have ridiculous names. So the question with the Austrians, right, is how are they so... Do they not think that this could go horribly wrong? And the weird thing is, in all these meetings, I mean, don't forget they've had like 1 billion meetings about this where they decided nothing. But as Chris Clark says in The Sleepwalkers, they never, ever really talk about what will happen if the Russians attack them.
And do they even if the Russians don't attack, do they have a kind of an end game?
No, they have no exit strategy. I mean, George W. Bush, take note. They have no plan for what will happen when it's over. Right. So they still haven't really agreed what they will do with Serbia. Tisa, the Hungarian guy, is still very much against annexing it. But as we've seen, there are other people like Count Hoyos who are like, let's actually partition Serbia and take bits of it for ourselves. By the way, this is all predicated on the idea that the Austrians will smash Serbia. And actually, we won't really get into this in this series. But actually, when the Austrians do attack Serbia, they are utterly humiliated and forced back into Austria. So, the idea that they're taking on
although in the long run, Serbia loses.
More than anybody.
More than anybody.
Yeah.
So,
but I mean, that's down to the fact that the Germans have to bail out the Austrians as much as anything. Anyway, Chris Clark has this wonderful line about it. It says the Austrians resembled hedgehogs scurrying across a highway with their eyes averted from the onrushing traffic. Because often when they're having these discussions, it's like, have they forgotten that Russia exists? Because they're not even mentioning it at all. And how do you explain that? One possibility is that they just think they're so dazzled by Germany's military prowess that they think they will deter the Russians. The Russians would never dare. And you can sort of see in the Cold War, client states of the United States or the Soviet Union might think that about their own patron. Cuba might think that about the USSR in the 1960s. No one will dare mess with us because...
Not incorrectly.
Yeah, because we've got a very powerful friend. Then there's the idea, I think, important thing with the Austrians, I think a lot of them genuinely think they have nothing to lose. That fatalism that we talked about the Germans is in their soul as well. They think their empire is in danger of breaking up. They just think if we don't do this now, what's the point? We might as well just leave the game. But also Chris Clark makes this point, and I think it's, again, as I've said before, I don't think it's one that a lot of historians appreciate enough. The Austrians are so convinced that they are right that it doesn't. They just think this point that you made. The Tsar, why would he support regicide terrorists? Sure, the Russians have different interests from us, but they will surely recognise that we have been wounded. The heir to our throne and his wife have been shot in cold blood. Why will of course the Russians will eventually say, yeah, fair enough. And if they do turn out to be, terrorist-loving monsters, then the Germans will just deal with them. So actually, we don't need to give them any thought at all. And in fact, I mean, unbelievably, they basically leave their eastern border undefended against the Russians because they're just like, well, yeah, let's not even think about that. Let's just concentrate on Serbia.
What's the worst that could go wrong?
What's the worst that could go wrong? Well, we could lose our entire empire. The dynasty breaks up, and it's all been for nothing. But they don't really, madly, they don't really envisage that. So on the 21st of July, Berchtold and Count Hoyos, they go to Bad Ischl, which is the sort of nice lakeside resort where the emperor...
Is there a spa?
Almost certainly there'll be a spa, Tom. Yeah. I imagine it's probably one of those places where there's a big casino and a promenade by the... people strolling with parasols and they're eating very sort of...
Concert halls.
Yeah, absolutely.
The faint strains of violins drifting across the
sound
lake.
A Johann Strauss waltz.
Yeah.
That's exactly what it is. You told me when we first we're going to do this series... Tom, I don't want to give the game away on the inside machinations of the rest of its history, but you wanted to make it 28 episodes, was it?
I did. Yes, I did. So this is my Kaiser-esque plan. And we'd focus on the politics, but we'd interleave it with episodes called A Riding School in Vienna or A Cricket Match at Hove. Little vignettes of the life that is about to be lost.
Yeah.
I still think that would have been fun.
Well, I mean, you've got it now, right? Because people are waltzing on the shores of Bad Ischl.
We could have had a whole episode on this. But Dominic, like the German military staff that he is, overruled me, the headstrong Kaiser.
There was no blank check there, Tom. It's fair to say.
No.
So anyway, as the last strains of Anton Bruckner are dying away in the distance, they hand over the text of the ultimatum to the emperor. And actually, Franz Joseph says when he sees it, he says... We'll describe the ultimatum in a subsequent episode, but he looks at what they've written and he says, this is actually quite harsh. Like, it's really harsh. And he says to them right then and there, there's no way the Russians will tolerate this. This is very, very harsh. But then, in that Austrian way, he says, yeah, but let's forget about the Russians.
Let's crack on.
Yeah, let's
Whatever.
do it anyway. Let's do it anyway. Berchtold said in his diary, the emperor was fully alive to the profound seriousness, even the tragedy of the current historical moment. But what an ironic line that is, because, of course, they have no idea, Tom, of just how serious and just how tragic that moment would turn out to be.
Right. Well, another brilliant episode, Dominic. Thank you. And we will find out what happens next on the road to war in our third episode, when we'll be looking at views from Russia and from France.
So not as planned. A boating party in Berlin, which was your original plan for episode.
No, we could have been having that. We could have been having maybe a governess... A governess in Montmartre. We could have had
strong words in the nursery. That was,
but instead we're going to have French diplomats, and we will be introducing some excellent French ambassadors. If you like comic French ambassadors, this series is definitely the one for you. So they will be featuring in our next episode.